night had settled over the northern valley with the kind of silence that felt woven by old spirits, a stillness broken only by the distant whisper of pines bowing under the cold breath of midnight. The moon hung full and pale above the ridge, its silver light spilling over the stone walls of the Pack's territory like a quiet blessing, like a warning, like a memory trying to surface from the depths of time. It was the hour when even the wolves slept with their ears half raised, the hour when magic thinned the veil between what was seen and what was meant. And in that suspended quiet, a soft, fragile sound rose from the darkness beyond the gate, faint, broken, the helpless whimper of a creature too small to understand fear. It came again, a trembling cry that barely disturbed the frozen air, followed by the drag of tiny hands against frost-bitten earth. No one inside the fortress heard it. Not the warriors resting in the barracks, not the sentinels who had momentarily turned away from the gate to warm their hands over braziers, and not the elders dreaming of ancient battles. Only the moon noticed the small shape moving across the clearing, a pale bundle shifting, inch by inch, through the tall winter grass. The baby crawled with the clumsy insistence of something driven not by instinct, but by fate, drawn toward the towering iron gates, as though an invisible thread pulled him from the shadows into the heart of the territory that should have killed anything uninvited. His breath came out in soft clouds, each exhale trembling against the cold. His fingertips brushed over stones slick with frost. His knees left faint trails in the thin layer of snow. A gust of wind pushed against him, almost toppling his small body sideways, but he steadied himself in a way no infant should have been able to, a determination far too old for the softness of his skin. He blinked up at the torchlight flickering above the gate, and when the flames reflected in his eyes, the truth shimmered, eyes too bright, too knowing, glowing faintly with a light that did not belong to the human world. He reached the final stretch of ground just as the wind shifted again, sweeping the air toward the inner courtyard. The scent that followed the breeze was faint but unmistakable, ancient and pure, infused with dominance and wild power, the scent of the Alpha. Inside the stronghold, in the highest room of the obsidian watchtower, the Alpha stood alone in the cold half-darkness. He had not slept in days. Sleep rarely came to him these nights. Not since the dreams returned. Not since the ghost of a promise whispered through his chest every time he closed his eyes. His name was Kyle, but no one spoke it lightly. The syllables carried the weight of winters survived, battles won, blood spilled, and a lineage older than the kingdom itself. He wore only dark trousers, and the heavy mantle of fur that rested across his shoulders like a shadow, the cold never daring to touch him. The moonlight painted his skin silver, tracing the lines of muscle and the scars that cut across his chest like half-forgotten warnings. He had been standing there for hours, watching the forest in silence, as if waiting for something he could not name. The air around him carried a tension like the moment before lightning strikes, sharp and charged, and his breath came slow and measured. But his eyes, those eyes were restless. A deep, animal instinct pulsed beneath his ribcage, something tugging at him, whispering, calling. It had been calling him since dusk. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones, in the buried part of him that belonged to prophecy and blood. Then, suddenly, he stiffened. There, a scent, faint as a memory, drifted through the window slit and scraped across his senses like a blade. His head snapped toward the gate, muscles coiling beneath his skin, the wolf inside him rising with a low growl that vibrated through the room. He stepped forward, placing one hand on the stone as his pupils contracted to slits, sharpening the darkness, filling it with shape. He inhaled again, slower this time. Impossible, unmistakable, an echo he had not felt in years. He vanished from the tower in a blur of movement, the air cracking behind him as he descended the staircase and crossed the courtyard with silent, predatory steps. Warriors turned their heads as he passed, sensing something rippling through the Alpha's aura, something ancient, dangerous, protective. But he did not speak to them. His body moved on instinct, led by the thread of scent woven through the night. His bare feet crushed ice without feeling it. His jaw was set, clenched, as if bracing against the impact of something he already knew he could not escape. When he reached the gate, the braziers flickered violently, flames bending toward him like they recognized their king. The iron bars rose tall and dark, frost clinging to their edges. The sentinels at the watchpost straightened immediately, stepping forward with hurried bows, but Cale barely acknowledged them. His gaze was fixed downward, toward the patch of snow disturbed by a shape so small it looked at first like a discarded cloth. But then the bundle moved. A tiny hand reached toward the firelight. Another cry broke the air, soft, hoarse, and heartbreakingly tired. Cale's breath left him in a slow exhale that seemed to hollow out the world. He stepped closer, the fur of his mantle brushing against the iron bars, and the baby lifted his face just enough for the flame to catch his eyes. It was that moment, that impossible second, when everything inside the Alpha stilled. The eyes, those eyes. They were a luminous shade of storm blue, ringed by silver, glowing faintly beneath the firelight, not with the hue of a newborn, not with the softness of a child untouched by life. They were old. They were familiar. They were the eyes he had seen haunted in his dreams, the eyes he had lost in a night drenched with blood and betrayal, the eyes he thought would never return to this world. His heartbeat faltered violently, a jolt of shock tearing through his chest. He gripped the gate with one hand, fingers sinking into the cold metal, as though he needed something to ground him. His throat tightened, not in fear, not in despair, but in an emotion far more dangerous for a man like him: recognition. The baby blinked once, twice. Then, impossibly, he reached toward Cale with both tiny hands, a gesture innocent and instinctive, yet so painfully reminiscent of a past that had broken him that the Alpha felt his breath catch. Behind him, the sentinels murmured, unsure of what they were seeing. No child should have been able to cross the outer forest alone. No child should have crawled through snow without freezing. No child should have glowed at the eyes like moonlight blessed by the gods. But Cale heard none of their whispers. His world had narrowed to that small, trembling body lying at his feet. The scent filled his lungs again, an unmistakable blend of wild magic and something softer, something achingly intimate. It struck him with a force that almost brought him to his knees. He pushed the gate open. The metal groaned like a beast waking, but Cale did not flinch. He stepped outside, the cold slashing across his skin, and lowered himself slowly, cautiously, as though approaching a sacred relic that might vanish if touched too abruptly. His shadow fell over the child, enveloping him completely, and the baby's whimpers softened, turning into a quiet, broken sigh. Cale reached out, hesitating for the first time in years. His hand hovered above the child's small frame. A warrior could face death with steady hands. But this shook him in ways no battle ever had. His fingertips brushed the edge of the blanket wrapped loosely around the infant, and warmth surged through his palm, an immediate connection that sent a shock through his spine. The baby looked up at him again. Those eyes. The universe could have cracked open beneath him, and he would not have noticed. His voice, when it finally emerged, was barely more than a whisper, rough and disbelieving, carved with the weight of 1,000 nights spent trying to forget. No, it wasn't denial. It was recognition. Recognition so sharp it felt like a wound reopening. The baby lifted one hand and touched Cale's wrist, a small, fragile touch. But the moment skin met skin, something ancient stirred in the air around them. The wind stopped. The flames stilled. The night held its breath. Cale closed his eyes. Because he knew. He knew the scent, the magic, the eyes, the impossible presence of a destiny he had tried to bury under duty and war. He knew exactly whose blood ran in the child's veins. He knew exactly what the gods were doing to him. And he knew, with a certainty that hollowed him out, that this child had not crawled here by accident. He had been brought, delivered, returned. The Alpha opened his eyes again, gaze locking onto the tiny face before him, and for the first time in years, the cold mask he wore cracked, not visibly, not to the warriors watching, but inside him, where the wolf curled around something fragile, protective, dangerous. The baby reached for him again. Cale exhaled a long, unsteady breath and lifted the child into his arms, the warmth of the small body searing against his chest like a brand, like a vow written in fire. And under the moonlight, with the child pressed against him, Cale whispered a name he had not dared speak since the night the world took everything from him. The wind howled softly through the pines as Cale carried the baby across the threshold of the gate, his steps slow, deliberate, each one echoing with an unease he refused to show. The warriors exchanged glances, silent questions flickering between them, but none dared speak. The Alpha's expression was carved from stone, But something thrummed beneath the surface, a tension in the rigid set of his shoulders, a quiet storm brewing in the depths of his breath. His mantle brushed against the stones as he walked, the fur trembling with the faint vibration of the wolf inside him, pacing, restless, agitated. The courtyard stretched before them, dimly lit by the scattered torches lining the walls. The flames hissed and snapped, casting long shadows against the frozen ground. Snow clung to every surface, glistening like shards of glass under the moon, and despite the frigid air that turned each exhale into mist, Kale radiated warmth, an aura so powerful it wrapped around the infant as if shielding him from the cold itself. The child had stopped whimpering the moment Kyle lifted him, as though instinctively recognizing the rhythm of the alpha's heartbeat, a steady, commanding thrum the baby seemed to settle against. But Kale did not settle. Inside him something was unraveling. The night tasted different now, heavy, bitter, thick with the ache of memories clawing their way back to the surface. His jaw tightened, his pulse quickening, even as he forced his face to remain unreadable. The child's tiny fingers curled into the fur lining of his mantle, tugging with the innocent trust of someone who did not understand what his presence unleashed. Kale could feel the sentinels watching his back as he crossed the courtyard, but he did not turn. He did not speak. He did not allow a single flicker of the turmoil inside him to show. Not when the kingdom depended on his strength. Not when weakness was a luxury he had buried long ago. The torches crackled louder as he approached the inner hall, their flames bending in his direction as though instinctively bowing to him. A gust of wind slammed the wooden door against its frame, and Kale paused for a heartbeat, letting the silence settle. The weight of the child in his arms felt unreal, too warm, too familiar, like a memory he had tried too hard to forget. He inhaled, long and slow, the scent of the baby filling his lungs, innocent, new, yet threaded with something ancient, something that made the wolf inside him bare its teeth, not in aggression, but in a kind of wounded reverence. He stepped into the hall. The air inside was warmer, scented with burning cedar and the distant aroma of herbs simmering in the kitchen. The stone floor beneath his feet was polished smooth by centuries of warriors passing through. Above him, the high ceiling arched in a cathedral-like sweep, shadows gathering in the beams like sleeping spirits. The hall was empty at this hour, save for the flickering candelabras lining the walls, their golden flames reflecting in the baby's luminous eyes. Kale stopped near the center of the hall, his breath unsteady for the first time. His arms tightened slightly around the child, not protectively, not yet, but with a hesitation that felt foreign to him. He looked down. The baby gazed back at him. Those storm-blue eyes glimmered with an understanding that no infant should possess. They were mirrors he didn't want to look into. Mirrors that forced him to see not just the child, but the shadows of a past drenched in blood and the grief he had buried beneath duty. Kyle swallowed hard. The hall felt too quiet, too revealing. His voice, when it came, was a low murmur, barely audible even to the flames dancing along the stone. "You shouldn't be here," the child cooed softly, unbothered by the sharpness in his tone, and Kale's jaw clenched again. He paced forward, his footsteps echoing, his mantle dragging behind him like the tail of a storm cloud. He could feel every muscle in his body tense, as if bracing for impact, as though carrying this child was somehow more dangerous than facing a legion of enemies at the border. He reached the far end of the hall where a tall window framed the moon. The glass was frosted, etched with patterns that resembled ancient runes, markings only the alpha lineage could decipher. Moonlight streamed through it, pale and cold, bathing Kale and the infant in a silver glow. The child blinked at the light, then nestled closer against Kyle's chest, his tiny breaths brushing against the alpha's skin like the ghost of a touch long lost. Kale froze. The sensation was too familiar, too intimately painful. He closed his eyes, the memory trying to claw its way up again. Another night, another moon, another small heartbeat pressed against his chest. But he forced the thought down, burying it with the ruthless discipline of a man who had no right to feel the warmth rising under his ribs. He turned away from the window. The shadows seemed to tighten around him, the hall suddenly too narrow, too suffocating. His breath quickened against his will. The familiar scent of stone, fire, pine. It all felt wrong with the baby in his arms, as if the world had shifted, tilting on an axis he could not control. Footsteps echoed softly near the doorway. Kyle lifted his head, eyes sharpening in an instant. A healer approached, Ira, the eldest of the pack's caretakers, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, her hair streaked with silver, her steps quiet but confident. She stopped a few paces away, her gaze dropping to the baby cradled against Cale's chest, her breath caught. But Cale spoke before she could. No questions. Ira swallowed her words so fast he could hear the pain scrape her throat. She lowered her gaze, bowing her head slightly. As you command, Alpha. Kyle exhaled slowly. Prepare the lower chamber. Her eyes widened before she masked her expression. The lower chamber was reserved for those under the Alpha's direct protection, those who carried significance, lineage, or danger. That Kale would place an unknown infant there. Ira bowed deeper. At once. She hurried away, footsteps fading into the corridor, leaving Kyle alone again. Alone with the child. Alone with the storm inside him. He looked down once more. The baby stared up at him with an expression that was not quite curiosity, not quite recognition, but something eerily in between. His eyes shimmered again, silver light flickering across the irises like moonlit waves. The glow was faint but undeniable, a mark of magic older than the pack itself. Kyle felt his throat tighten. You shouldn't have those eyes, he whispered, voice cracking almost imperceptibly. The baby reached up again, brushing his fingers against Kale's collarbone, innocent and trusting. The simple gesture nearly shattered the Alpha's composure. Memories surged like a tidal wave. Another small hand. Another soft cry. Another night when fate had taken everything from him. He shut his eyes. His breath trembled. He could not allow this. He could not feel this. Not again. The wolf inside him paced violently, snarling at the conflict tearing him apart. Every instinct told him to reject the child, to push him away before the past trapped him again. But another instinct, buried deeper, older, far more primal, rose with equal force. Claim, protect, recognize. Kyle opened his eyes, the war inside him visible in the tightness of his jaw, the harsh rise and fall of his chest. He moved through the hall, descending the stone steps that led to the lower chambers. The torches lining the staircase flickered as he passed, their flames bending toward him once more. The darkness thickened the deeper he went, the air cooling, the stones damp with ancient history. He reached the chamber door. It was carved from ironwood, marked with sigils of protection that pulsed faintly under the moon's distant influence. Kyle pushed it open with one hand, the hinges groaning like a creature waking from slumber. Inside, the chamber was dim, warmed only by a single hearth in the corner. Furs covered the floor, and a bed of woven wool stood against the wall, prepared for someone of significance. Kyle stepped inside, the baby's weight grounding him even as his soul felt like it was tearing. He stood there, unmoving. For a long moment, the fire crackled softly. The baby breathed against his chest. The wolf inside him whispered a truth he did not want to hear. Kyle lowered himself onto one knee, then slowly onto the edge of the bed. He loosened the blanket around the child, revealing tiny hands, a small chest rising and falling, a faint mark on the baby's left shoulder. Kyle froze. A mark, a sigil, a birthright, a symbol he had sworn never to see again. His hand trembled, not visibly, but internally, a tremor that carried through his bones. He reached forward, brushing his thumb across the mark. The moment he made contact, heat flared, not burning, but warm, familiar, aching. The baby cooed softly. Kale's entire body went still. His breathing stopped. His heartbeat faltered. Time fractured. He rose abruptly, turning away from the child, bracing both palms against the cold stone wall. His breath came ragged now, the mask breaking, the past bleeding through the cracks. The chamber felt too small, too dark, too full of ghosts. His voice emerged hoarse. Why, did you come here? As if the baby could answer. As if fate wasn't cruel enough already. He dragged a hand through his hair, pulling until it hurt, grounding himself in the pain. His shoulders shook once, silent, violent, before he forced himself upright again. He turned back toward the infant. The baby stared at him, eyes glowing softly, silver blue and impossibly familiar. In those eyes, Kale saw everything he had lost, everything he had failed to protect, everything the moon had taken from him, and the truth he refused to accept. Fate had returned what destiny had stolen. No, not returned. Reborn. Kale inhaled sharply, as though swallowing fire. His wolf stilled. His fate shifted. The chamber seemed to pulse around him, the air thick with prophecy. Cale stepped toward the child, and for the first time since the night the world ended for him, he whispered a single word. Not a question, not a denial, but a trembling acceptance he wasn't ready to face. You. The chamber felt suspended between breaths, as though the world outside its walls had stilled in anticipation, waiting for the moment to break open. Kyle stood rigid, his body carved from shadow and moonlight, the weight of his presence so immense it seemed to press against the very stones around him. He had always been a man of silent storms, a force that did not need to roar to be obeyed. But in that room, dim, warm, haunted, his power crystallized into something sharper, darker, and impossibly intimate. The baby lay on the bed of furs, tiny against the expanse of woven wool, his small chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm. Yet the air around him shimmered faintly, a distortion of light and magic, as though the child carried a pulse of energy older than the kingdom itself. And Kyle felt it, every beat of it, resonating through the chamber like a second heartbeat beneath his own, an echo too familiar to dismiss, too dangerous to accept. He stood motionless for a long time, watching the moonlight slide across the infant's face. His breathing came slow and controlled, but the tension in his body betrayed him. The way his fingers curled unconsciously, the way his shoulders tightened as though battling an unseen force. The wolf inside him paced with growing agitation, recognizing a truth the man was not ready to acknowledge. And then Cale moved. His steps were slow, heavy with an authority that shook the air. Each stride drew shadows to him, bending light, commanding silence. He circled the bed as if assessing a threat, though his eyes, sharp, cold, storm-dark, held something far more dangerous than suspicion. They held memory, pain, and the beginning of something he did not want to feel again. He stopped at the side of the bed, towering over the child. The baby blinked up at him, small, unafraid, his silver blue eyes reflecting Cale's own. The alpha exhaled through his nose, a breath barely audible yet carrying the weight of a man who had led armies, buried comrades, and carved his reign through winters of blood and prophecy. His voice, when it came, was a low whisper of gravel and iron. You carry a power you should not. The baby stirred softly, the faintest sound escaping his lips, a quiet sigh, fragile and warm. Kyle's jaw tightened. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the baby's forehead without touching, as though fearing the consequences of contact. His hand, large, scarred, strong enough to crush stone, trembled almost imperceptibly. The wolf in him snarled at the hesitation, urging him to claim, to hold, to protect. Cale withdrew his hand sharply. He turned away, pacing the length of the chamber with steps heavy enough to shake the ironwood door. His mantle shifted around him like storm clouds dragging across the sky. His breath thickened, memories clawing up from the depths he had locked them in. His muscles tensed as he walked, the movement barely containing the rage, grief, and instinct warring beneath his skin. He stopped abruptly, placing both hands on the cold stone wall. The tension in his arms was palpable, every line of his body tight with an emotion he refused to name. I buried those eyes, he murmured, voice cracking like a fracture in ice. I laid them to rest under a sky that did not deserve them. The baby whimpered, a soft, broken sound. Cale's head snapped toward the bed. The sound shouldn't have affected him, but it did. It hit him with the force of an old wound tearing open, a slash of emotion so raw he had to inhale deeply, forcing air into his lungs. The baby whimpered again, softer this time, as though calling him, calling the instincts inside him that he had spent years suppressing. The alpha crossed the room in 2 strides. He knelt beside the bed, not gently, not gracefully, but with the urgency of a man fighting the current of his own soul. The fur mantle slid off one shoulder, exposing the scar that carved diagonally across his chest. A scar he had earned the night everything changed, the night he lost the eyes now staring up at him. He leaned closer, the heat of his body enveloping the child in a cocoon of wild strength. His aura flared, uncontrolled, powerful, ancient. The flames in the hearth shuddered violently, shadows recoiled. The baby's breathing steadied instantly, as though soothed by the storm hovering above him. Kyle clenched his teeth. You do not fear me, he whispered, eyes narrowing. You should. But the baby blinked slowly, calmly, like someone who recognized the man behind the monster, like someone who had known him long before this lifetime. And Kyle felt his pulse stutter. The wolf inside him stilled, ears pricked, recognizing that silent acknowledgement. A bond, not yet formed, not yet accepted, but undeniably present, hovered like smoke between them. He lowered his hand again. This time, he let his fingers touch the baby's chest, and the world shifted. Magic surged like wildfire, silent, bright, ancient, rushing from the child's skin into Kale's palm, racing up his arm and exploding behind his ribs in a burst of heat and memory. Kale recoiled, breath stolen, eyes widening with shock. The wolf inside him roared, a howl of recognition, of claim, of destiny. Kale pressed his hand to the floor to steady himself, his breath tearing out of him. He looked at the child again, and his expression changed, not noticeably to anyone else, but inside him a line had broken, a truth had settled, a past he'd tried to bury had risen. He reached forward, picking up the child despite the tremor in his hands. As soon as the baby touched his chest, the magic pulsed again, softer this time, like a heartbeat syncing with his own. Kale inhaled sharply, as if the moment pierced straight through the armor around his soul. He rose to his full height, and for the first time, the full force of the Alpha's presence filled the chamber. His posture straightened, shoulders squared, spine rigid. Shadows curled around him. The air grew thick with the scent of power, pine resin, cold iron, and moonlit wind. His eyes darkened further, deepening to a storm-wrought blue that mirrored the baby's own. The wolf in him pressed forward, its growl vibrating through his chest, protective, possessive, ancient. Kyle looked down at the baby, and the child, tiny, fragile, impossibly brave, rested his palm over the scar on Kale's chest, with a familiarity that stole the Alpha's breath. Kale swallowed hard. His voice emerged low, as though torn from the depths of him. You are bound to me. The baby blinked, as if understanding. Kale exhaled slowly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. And to you. He did not know if he meant the admission. He did not want to mean it, but the connection pulsed between them. Quiet, powerful, undeniable. A thread of destiny jangled tight, reattaching itself after being severed years ago. A sound echoed from the corridor, footsteps approaching. Kale's expression sharpened instantly. His aura flared, cold and lethal, pulling tight around the child in a protective shield. The temperature in the room dropped. The fire dimmed. Every trace of softness in the Alpha vanished, replaced by the merciless instinct of a king defending what was his. The footsteps hesitated outside the door. A warrior's voice, hushed with fear, called through the wood. Alpha, the council requests your... Kale didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air itself growled. The warrior retreated instantly, his footsteps scrambling backward. Kale stood in the center of the room, the baby pressed against his chest, his breath controlled but sharp. His heartbeat pounded with a violent rhythm, torn between duty and something far more primal. His stance was wolf-like, powerful, possessive, ready to tear through anyone who tried to come near. He looked down again. The baby's fingers curled into the fur at his shoulder, anchoring himself. Kale inhaled, long and slow. His voice came out rough, reverent, broken. You came back. He hadn't meant to say it aloud, had never intended to give shape to the truth clawing its way through him, but the words slipped free like blood through a wound that no longer wanted to stay closed. The baby blinked once, and Kyle's world tilted. He sank onto the nearest chair, elbows resting on his knees, the child balanced carefully in his arms. His breath brushed over the baby's forehead, warming the cool skin. He studied the tiny face, the round cheeks, the soft lashes, the impossibly familiar eyes. His eyes. The child's presence filled the room, softening the corners of Kale's world, even as a storm gathered behind his ribs. He felt the threads of destiny tightening around them, binding them in ways he was not prepared for. He leaned back, head tilted upward, staring at the ceiling as though searching for answers in the ancient beams. Why now? He whispered. Why like this? The baby made a small sound, half sigh, half coo, and Kale's eyes drifted shut. The sound struck him with more force than any prophecy, any battle. any loss he had ever endured, because it wasn't just a sound, it was a memory, a promise, a return. Cale opened his eyes slowly. His gaze was raw now, stripped of the armor he wore before his pack, before his enemies, before the world. Only one emotion lived there, painful, powerful, piercing straight through him. Recognition. Not of who the child was, but of what he meant, of what fate demanded of him. Kyle rose once more, holding the baby against his chest, power rippling around him like a living force. He stood in the center of the chamber, framed by torchlight and shadow, every line of him carved from dominance and destiny. He looked at the child's eyes and whispered, with a truth that felt like surrender, "You are mine." The fire in the chamber had begun to die, shrinking into glowing embers that pulsed like a quiet heartbeat, painting the stone walls with flickering strokes of red and gold. Shadows stretched long across the floor, reaching toward Kyle as he stood there, holding the child as if he were holding a piece of a life he no longer trusted himself to remember. The air thickened, warm, heavy, sweet with the scent of old cedar and the lingering whisper of magic. A faint mist drifted through the room, thin as breath, shimmering faintly where it caught the moonlight filtering through the single window. It moved not like something led by the wind, but like something aware, something drawn toward the child. Cale's grip tightened. He sensed it instantly. The shift, the change, the ripple through the air that did not belong to the living. The wolf inside him stirred, fur rising, instinct snapping awake with a growl that rumbled through Cale's chest. His stance solidified, body coiling with the primal readiness of a king who had survived both prophecy and blood. A sound, soft, metallic, almost delicate, clang against the stone near the bed. Cale's head turned sharply. A small object, previously hidden beneath the folds of the infant's blanket, had rolled loose and come to rest on the floor. The moment his eyes met it, the temperature in the room dropped. The chamber inhaled. The old runes carved into the walls seemed to pulse. Cale's heart stopped. "No," he breathed, voice hollowing into disbelief. His steps were slow but heavy as he approached the object, each footfall landing with the weight of inevitability. The baby shifted in his arms, sensing the tension threading through every muscle in his body. When Cale reached the object, he knelt, the motion deliberate, reverent, as though approaching a grave. His fingers hovered above the small metal charm, a pendant no larger than a coin, shaped like a crescent moon pierced by a single star. Its silver surface was scratched, worn, stained by time, but the symbol itself was unmistakable. Kyle had carved that pendant, with his own hands, for someone he had loved like breath, for someone the gods had taken from him. Slowly, painfully slowly, he picked it up. Warm. The pendant was warm. It shouldn't have been. Cale closed his fist around it, and the warmth sank into his skin, rising through his palm like fire swallowing frost. His breath stalled, caught between memory and shock, and his eyes shut for a moment, long and anguished. He could still feel the night he had bound that pendant with a vow, his vow, sealed with the blood of his lineage, a vow that should have died with her. He opened his eyes again, gaze falling back to the infant. The baby stared up at him, wide-eyed, small hand reaching toward the pendant as if drawn to it. "No," Cale murmured, shaking his head once, fiercely, violently, as if denying the truth could somehow erase it. "This is not possible." But the pendant glowed, a soft, silver-blue pulse, the same color as the child's eyes. Cale stumbled to his feet, not physically unbalanced. His body was too strong for that, but emotionally fractured, hollowed out by a truth so heavy it bent him. He backed away, the child pressed against his chest, his breath uneven, broken in a way that betrayed the man beneath the alpha. He lifted the pendant again, staring at it as though it were a blade pointed at his heart. "I gave this," he whispered, voice hoarse, "on the night she chose me, on the night fate marked us as one." His memories flashed, the touch of soft hands, the glow of firelight on a face he had loved beyond reason, the sound of laughter turning to screams, the scent of blood, the coldness of the world the moment she slipped away. He had buried the pendant with her, and yet, here it was, around the neck of the child who bore her eyes. Cale sank onto the edge of the bed, the child in one arm, the pendant in the other. The fire cast a thin line of gold across his face, illuminating the tremor in his jaw, the rigid line of his throat as he swallowed. He lifted the baby slightly, looking at him not with fear, not with authority, but with the raw, shaken disbelief of a man seeing a ghost. The baby blinked slowly. One long, knowing blink. Cale inhaled sharply. "It cannot be you," he whispered, voice cracking. She died. I saw her take her last breath. I held her as the moon rose above us. I buried her with my own hands." The baby reached toward the pendant. Kyle closed his eyes. Because in that moment, something deep inside him shifted. Something he had locked away with his grief. Something powerful, ancient, instinctual. The pendant pulsed again. This time, a soft sound echoed through the room. A faint chime, like distant bells, like something from the spirit realm touching the mortal world. Cale's eyes flew open. The air shimmered faintly around the child, mist spiraling upward in soft patterns that resembled moonlight weaving itself into shape. Cale felt his throat tighten. He had seen this before, only once. The night she died. The night her spirit had flickered like this, light swirling around her, brushing his skin, whispering something he had not understood then. A promise, a warning, a return. "No," he choked, shaking his head again even as the truth clawed its way through him. "No, do not do this to me. Do not ask me to believe in miracles after all the blood I've spilled." But the mist thickened, circling the child in a soft halo of shimmering light. It brushed Cale's hand, warm as a memory, familiar as a breath he thought he had forgotten. He stared at the child. "Who sent you?" The words tore from him like a broken plea. "Who brought you to my gate?" The mist rippled, then it vanished, as though swallowed by the baby's next breath. Cale's entire body shuddered. Something cracked inside him, something old, something buried beneath the weight of leadership, war, loss. The wolf inside him howled in recognition, pressing against his ribs, urging him to accept what the man could not. He rose abruptly, pacing the room in slow, heavy strides, one hand pressed to his forehead, the pendant clutched in the other. His aura flared so violently that the flames in the hearth stretched toward him, bending in submission. His breathing grew rough, uneven, as if every inhale battled the truth forming his new reality. He turned back to the child. "You came with her pendant," he said softly, dangerously, reverently, "with her magic clinging to your skin, with her eyes looking at me as though you remember." His voice faltered. "As though you know me." He moved toward the bed again, sitting beside the child, his posture tense, his presence overwhelming enough to make the air thrum. He held the pendant above the baby, letting it sway gently. The baby reached for it. Cale's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "You carry her mark," he whispered. "Her birthright, her moon," he swallowed, "and my blood." The admission tasted like fire, painful, truthful, unavoidable. A warmth rose under his ribs, a warmth he did not want, did not trust, did not understand. It grew slowly, painfully, spreading through him like a sunrise pushing back the night. He reached out with one shaking hand and touched the baby's cheek with the back of his knuckles. Slow, reverent, terrified, the child leaned into the touch. Cale's breath fractured. "You are hers," he whispered, "but you are also—" He could not say it, could not admit the word, could not breathe it into existence. The baby blinked once, soft, trusting, impossibly knowing. Cale closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids he saw her face again, heard her voice, felt her hand slipping from his grasp the night she died. The promise she tried to speak before the light left her eyes. "Find me again." Cale inhaled sharply, eyes snapping open. The chamber felt different now, charged, electric, thrumming with destiny. The pendant glowed faintly. The mark on the baby's shoulder shimmered, and Cale finally understood. Finally. He stared at the child with an expression that was not quite fear, not quite awe, but the kind of recognition that breaks a man open. "You are not a mistake," he whispered. "You are not a stranger." He lowered his head, forehead nearly touching the baby's. "You were sent back." His voice trembled. "She is here. In you." The child's hand touched his cheek, soft, warm, familiar. Cale closed his eyes and breathed her name, not out of memory, not out of grief, but out of recognition, out of return. The night outside thickened, pressing against the stones of the stronghold as if the darkness itself sensed the shift unfolding in the chamber below. The moon hung lower now, no longer a steady witness but a trembling lantern casting brittle light across the courtyard. The wind rose in sharp, restless currents, rattling arrow slits, stirring torches into frantic shapes. Something had changed in the bones of the kingdom, something heavy, ancient, awakening after a long slumber, and inside the lower chamber, Chaol felt it, not with his eyes, not with his thoughts, but with his blood. He sat on the edge of the bed, the infant resting in the cradle of one arm, the pendant lying against the child's chest like a silver heartbeat. The room seemed to pulse in tandem with it. Shadows crawled across the walls in slow, serpentine motions, as though the past, his past, had risen from the grave and now prowled around him, whispering truths he had spent years refusing to hear. Chaol inhaled deeply, steadying himself, but nothing inside him was steady. The fire in the hearth snapped violently, sending a shower of sparks across the furs. The baby flinched, a small twitch, fragile and instinctive. Immediately, without thought, Chaol wrapped his mantle around the child, shielding him from even the smallest ember. The protective movement was automatic, too automatic, and Chaol froze the moment he realized what he had done. He looked down at the tiny face nestled against his chest. The child's silver blue eyes stared up at him, unblinking, calm, trusting. Chaol's pulse stuttered. He shouldn't trust me, Chaol thought. I shouldn't trust him. But fate had already woven the first threads. Before he could breathe again, footsteps echoed down the corridor, this time heavier, more deliberate. Not the hesitating scrape of a warrior afraid to disturb the alpha. This was controlled, assertive, expectant. Kyle's head lifted sharply. His aura expanded instantly, filling the chamber with a pressure that made the air thicken. The wolf inside him rose, baring its fangs in a silent, territorial snarl. The fire dimmed under the force of his power, as though it bowed to the storm gathering inside him. He stood slowly, every line of his body sharpening into lethal readiness. The pendant pulsed. The child's breathing quickened. The footsteps drew closer. Kyle turned toward the door. A knock sounded, low, resonant. "Alpha," a voice called from the other side, deep, measured. "The council has convened. They demand nothing," Chaol growled, the sound vibrating through the stones. "Not from me." A pause, then a different voice. This one elder, slick with the weight of centuries, replied, "You brought an unknown child beyond the gate. The law demands we assess the threat." At the word child, Chaol's jaw flexed with dangerous tension. Assess? Threat? His aura surged, freezing the very air around him. He took a single step forward, and the stone under his heel cracked. "There is no threat here," Chaol said, his voice low and lethal. "Stand down." But the elders did not retreat. Of course they didn't. They were not warriors frightened by instinct. They were the keepers of the old laws, those who remembered the prophecy Chaol had spent years refusing to acknowledge, those who feared the return of a power that had once nearly torn the kingdom apart. The older voice spoke again, sharper now. "The magic around him is not natural." Kyle's breath slowed. His gaze drifted down to the baby in his arms. Not natural, not safe, not allowed. Words he'd heard before, spoken about someone he had once loved, someone the council had feared, someone they had failed to protect the night everything fell apart. Chaol exhaled through his nose, a breath that burned like molten iron. "I will not repeat the past," he muttered to himself. "I will not let you take him." He moved closer to the door, cradling the child as though he were something fragile and impossibly valuable. The runes carved into the ironwood glowed faintly under his shadow, reacting to his presence. But before he could speak again, the elders on the other side began muttering something, a chant, low and rhythmic. The hairs on Chaol's arms rose. The temperature dropped. Magic seeped through the cracks under the door in thin tendrils, seeking, testing, smelling. Kyle snarled. His aura exploded outward, slamming into the door with a blast of raw dominance. The glowing tendrils recoiled instantly, retreating like frightened snakes. The chanting cut off, then silence. Kyle stepped back, chest rising and falling with slow, controlled fury. He knew what they had attempted, a detection spell, a reading of lineage and soul. He also knew why they had failed, because the magic around the child wasn't meant for them. It wasn't meant for the council. It wasn't meant for anyone except— Cale closed his eyes. Except him. He felt the truth in his blood, thrumming beneath his skin, calling to something deep and sacred, but he did not want to answer it. He opened his eyes again, looking down at the baby. The infant lifted a hand, barely more than a twitch, and brushed tiny fingers against Cale's chest, right over the scar. Heat pulsed beneath Cale's ribs, a warmth that shouldn't have existed, a memory that shouldn't have returned, a bond that shouldn't have survived death. Cale swallowed hard. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in as the weight of everything pressed against him. The council outside, the kingdom above, the ancient laws waiting to snap like iron traps around the slightest weakness. And the child in his arms, the child with her eyes, her magic, her pendant. He moved to the far corner of the room, standing before the window slit carved into the stone. The moonlight fell across him and the child, silvering the edges of their silhouettes. Snow drifted outside, swirling in slow, graceful spirals like spirits dancing. Kyle looked out over the darkened courtyard. He could sense them. Elders gathering, warriors shifting uneasily, the entire pack stirring with the taste of unease. The kingdom felt brittle, like the moment before a winter storm shatters the first branch. The baby stirred. Cale looked down. "What are you?" he whispered. Not in accusation, but in awe, in fear, in broken tenderness. The child blinked slowly, and Cale froze, because for just a heartbeat, barely long enough to trust, he saw another face superimposed over the infant's. Her face, her eyes, her expression from the night she died. His breath caught in his throat. He closed his eyes, willing the vision away. When he opened them again, the child was just a child. But Cale's heartbeat had already changed rhythm, sinking to something older, deeper, more dangerous. Footsteps echoed again in the corridor. This time, many. Kyle turned. He felt the shift in the walls, the pressure of authority, of expectation, of danger. The council was not leaving. They were gathering. They wanted the child. They wanted answers. They wanted control. Cale's grip tightened around the baby instinctively, possessively. "No one touches him," he whispered, first to himself, then to the wolf inside him, then to the world. He stepped toward the center of the chamber. The fire dimmed, the torches bent, the shadows bowed. Cale stood tall, every line of him carved from power and defiance. His aura swelled, thick with warning, with promise, with war. The baby nestled against him, unworried. Cale's jaw clenched. "I have lost too much," he whispered. "I will not lose him." A knock slammed against the door, harder this time. "Alpha," the elder called, voice echoing with authority he did not deserve. "Open the chamber. The child belongs to the council now." Cale lifted his chin. His voice came out like thunder. "He belongs to me." Silence. A stunned pause. Then the elder spoke again, colder now. "You break the ancient law." Kyle laughed once. Low, dark, merciless. "I am the law." The corridor erupted into murmurs. Tension thickened until even the stones trembled. Kyle stepped closer to the door, baby in his arms, aura blazing. "If any of you force your way into this chamber," he growled, "I will consider it an act of war." The murmurs died instantly. He could smell their fear through the wood, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Cale turned away from the door, pressing the baby closer to his chest. Anxiety, fear, instinct, destiny, all tangled in his blood. He moved toward the bed, sitting again, but his posture was rigid, every muscle coiled like a bowstring. He brushed a thumb across the baby's cheek. "What do I do with you?" he whispered, voice raw. "What does fate expect of me now?" The child with her eyes blinked up at him, and Kyle felt the room tighten around a truth he could no longer outrun. The kingdom was already moving. The council would not stop. The past was no longer buried. The child was not just a child. And Kyle had already chosen his side. The pressure outside the chamber did not dissipate. It settled, coiled around the stones like a living thing, like a serpent disguised as silence. Cale could feel the council's presence even when they stopped knocking, could sense the weight of unspoken decisions forming behind the old ironwood doors. They would not forget. They would not forgive defiance. They would not ignore the arrival of a child wrapped in magic and prophecy, and the remnants of a woman they had never truly understood. But for the first time in years, Chaol did not care what the council would or would not do. The laws they clung to had already taken too much from him. Their fear had already cost him one life. He would not let it claim another. He rose from the bed once more, slowly this time, careful not to disturb the child pressing against his chest. The baby's breath was warm, soft against his skin, a fragile rhythm that somehow steadied him at the same time that it threatened to break whatever remained of his armor. Chaol moved toward the center of the room, standing beneath the low beam that cut a line of shadow across his shoulders, making his already imposing frame seem carved from the very bones of the stronghold. The pendant lay against the baby's chest, glinting faintly with each flicker of the fire. The mark on the child's shoulder shimmered beneath the edge of the blanket. Her symbol, his blood, their past, their future. His fingers tightened around the small body in his arms. He had carried battle-wounded warriors, bleeding and broken, through snow and mud. He had carried fallen brothers to their rest, had carried the weight of a crown he never asked for, the weight of a prophecy he never wanted. But this weight was different. It was light, and yet impossibly heavy, as if the entire kingdom had been condensed into the fragile warmth against his chest. The wolf inside him lay low now, not pacing, not snarling, but curled protectively around something it recognized as its own. The beast understood before the man did. It often had. Chaol lifted his head, eyes narrowing as he stared at the door, at the invisible barrier between himself and the council. He knew they would regroup, adjust their strategy, wait for dawn, when his power was less sharpened by the moon. They would come with rules and rituals, with incense and words soaked in old magic. They would attempt to classify the child, measure him, label him as risk or omen or salvation, but they would not see him the way Chaol saw him now. They never saw her either. Not truly. Chaol shifted his stance. The decision had already been made the moment the baby touched his scar, the moment the pendant warmed in his hand, the moment those eyes looked at him not like a stranger, but like someone who remembered. He just hadn't admitted it to himself, not until now. He turned away from the door. The chamber seemed to watch him as he moved, the very stones holding their breath. He crossed to the small alcove carved into the wall, where a basin of darkened water reflected the faint glow of the flames. He leaned forward slightly, so the water caught both his face and the child's. For a long moment, he simply stared. The reflection was almost cruel in its clarity. His own features looked harsher than he remembered, shadows carved deep under his eyes, jaw set like stone, hair falling messily over his brow. The scar on his chest peeked from beneath the edge of his mantle, a pale slash against sunless skin, and in the center of his reflection, cradled against him, was the baby. So small, so impossibly calm. Two pairs of eyes stared back at him, one storm-dark, the other storm-bright, both rimmed with silver. The resemblance was undeniable, to him, to her, to everything they had been, and everything the gods apparently refused to let die. Chaol let out a slow breath that clouded over the surface of the water, blurring their mirrored faces. "They will try to take you from me," he murmured, the words barely louder than the crackle of embers. "They will call it necessary. They will call it duty." His mouth twisted. "They will call it protection. For the kingdom." The baby shifted slightly, pressing his cheek against Chaol's chest, as if listening, as if anchoring himself to the steady drum of the alpha's heartbeat. Chaol's hand moved almost unconsciously, cupping the back of the child's head, fingers splaying through the fine, soft hair in a gesture that felt too natural, too familiar, too dangerous. "But I know what their protection looks like," he continued, voice deepening, thickening with memory that tasted of steel and smoke. "I saw how much blood they were willing to spill in the name of order. I watched them fear what they could not control, and sacrifice what they did not understand." The mist at the edges of the chamber stirred, swirling as though the past had heard him and agreed. He straightened, lifting his gaze from the water to the flames. The fire had almost burned down, but still it fought for breath, devouring what little wood remained with stubborn determination. A quiet echo of what burned in Chaol's chest now. "I will not let them write your story with their fear," he whispered. His voice had shifted, no longer a confession, but a vow. Not this time. He moved back toward the bed and sat down again, but there was a new gravity in the way he held himself now. in the quiet, feral focus that sharpened his eyes. Outside, beyond stone and torchlight, a wolf howled in the distance, long and mournful, its cry carrying over the frozen trees like a question thrown at the sky. Another howl answered, then another. The pack felt the shift as well. Instinct was older than law, older than magic, older than fear. It knew when something sacred had entered the world. Cale listened for a moment, letting the familiar song wash over him, feeling the subtle change in its rhythm. The calls were not just territorial, not just the regular patrol's notification. There was a note of tension there, unease, curiosity, perhaps even reverence. "They can sense you," Kyle said softly, looking into the child's bright eyes. "They don't know why. Not yet, but they will." The baby stared back at him, gaze unwavering. For all his smallness, there was a strange gravity in those eyes, a depth that did not belong to new life. Kyle felt their weight, their pull. Souls weren't supposed to return like this. Not in the way he remembered her. Not with the intact echo of magic that still hummed between them whenever his skin brushed the baby's. But the world had never truly cared for supposed to. Not for him. Not for her. Not for whatever this was. He slipped the pendant from between the folds of the blanket and held it between them, letting it catch the last gasp of firelight. "They buried this with her body," he whispered, thumb brushing over the crescent moon. "I carved it as a promise, that I would protect her, that I would stand between her and whatever tried to break her." The metal warmed under his touch, as if remembering too, or as if responding to the presence of the child who wore it now. His jaw tightened. "I failed," he said simply. No dramatics, no flourish, just a truth heavy enough to bend a king. "I did not get there in time. I did not see the knives behind their words. I did not hear what the moon was trying to tell me until the blood was already on the snow." The baby stirred restlessly, a small sound leaving his lips, as if some old part of the soul within him recognized the echo of that night. Cale's grip around him instinctively tightened. "I cannot go back," Cale continued, voice low, deliberate, dangerous. "I cannot fix what has already been carved into the bones of this land." He lowered his head until his mouth was close enough that his next words warmed the child's hair. "But I can decide what happens now." The last of the fire collapsed into embers, plunging the room into a softer darkness, lit only by the distant moon and the faint glow of old runes responding to the Alpha's resolve. The air changed, thickening with intent, humming with the weight of a choice made not only as a ruler, but as a man. Cale shifted the baby carefully, one hand supporting the small back, the other cradling the soft curve of his head. He looked down at the bundle in his arms, at the life that had crawled alone through frost and darkness to his gate, guided by a force that refused to be denied. "You came to me," he said, no longer asking how or why. "Across forest and shadow and snow, at the moon's peak, at midnight." His voice softened at the edges. "You were brought to my gate, to my door, to my arms." He inhaled sharply, and when he spoke again, each syllable came as carefully as a blade being pulled from its sheath. "That means you are mine to keep." The decision settled inside him like a stone dropped into still water. There was no going back from it, no softening its impact, no pretending he had chosen otherwise. He would protect the child, against the council, against the kingdom, against prophecy itself if he had to, even if it meant turning his own power against the pack he had sworn to lead, even if it meant war. A faint shudder moved through the walls, like the stronghold itself reacting to the shift in his intent. The runes flickered. Somewhere above, a piece of ice cracked and slid from the roof, shattering against the stones below. The sound echoed faintly through the silent corridors, like the breaking of something that had been frozen for far too long. Cale stood with the child cradled against him, and walked to the window slit once more. The first pale hints of dawn were beginning to touch the horizon, thin, hesitant strokes of light stretching across the bruised sky. Night was not over yet, but the promise of morning lingered there, fragile and inevitable. He watched the horizon for a long moment, shoulders squared, spine unbent, the aura around him almost visible in its intensity. "They will test me," he murmured, as if speaking not only to the baby, but to the wind, the stones, the ghosts of those who had come before. "They will push, they will threaten." His eyes narrowed, storm-dark and unwavering. "Let them." He lowered his gaze to the infant, who was watching him in that too quiet, too knowing way. The silver ring around the child's irises caught the weak light of almost dawn, turning them into two small mirrors of the sky. They took everything once, Kyle said more softly now, his voice a rough caress of gravel and ember. This time, they will learn what it means to try and take what is mine. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. Power hummed through them anyway, resonating in the chamber, in the stones, in the very air. Somewhere outside, wolves howled again, their cries layered, loyalty, confusion, anticipation, as if they too felt the shift, as if they too knew that their alpha had just made a decision that would change the shape of their world. Kale leaned down and pressed his forehead gently to the baby's, closing his eyes just for a heartbeat. The gesture was intimate in a way no one alive had ever seen from him. It was a vow without words, a promise sealed not by ritual, but by the quiet force of a man who had already survived losing everything once. "You came back to me," he whispered, the confession tasting like surrender and absolution all at once. "I will not let fate take you away again." The child's tiny hand lifted clumsily, fingers brushing the side of Kale's neck, warm and new and impossibly familiar. The contact sent a subtle flare of magic through the alpha's veins, as if some old bond had rethreaded itself, stronger than before, rewritten through death and rebirth. Kale straightened slowly, still holding the baby close, and turned his gaze once more toward the dawning horizon. The first ray of light finally broke over the ridge, thin and pale, slipping into the chamber like a timid secret. It touched Kale's face. It brushed the child's cheek. It caught the pendant and made it glow. A new day was coming, and with it, a war no one else yet understood. The elders would gather their texts and their rules. The warriors would sharpen their blades. The forest would hold its breath. The moon would watch with that cold, knowing eye it had always turned toward him. Kale only tightened his hold on the child, and let his lips curve into something that was not quite a smile, not quite a snarl, but a quiet, terrifying acceptance of the path laid before them. The alpha of the pack stood in the first light of dawn, a reincarnated soul sleeping against his chest, the scent of destiny in the air. Outside, the kingdom believed it still knew its laws. Inside, in that chamber carved from stone and vow and stubborn love, a new law had already been written. He would protect the child, from the council, from the kingdom, from whatever had ripped their world apart once before. The gate where the baby had crawled at midnight would remember this night. The walls would remember. The moon would remember. And one day, when small hands were no longer so small, and those bright eyes looked back at him with the full weight of the soul they carried, the child would remember too. For now, though, the baby only sighed and settled, lulled by the steady beat of the alpha's heart. Kale watched the horizon as the sky lightened, the night slowly giving way, not in defeat, but in a quiet promise that darkness would return, as it always did, as it would, for them, as their story began not in sunlight, but in midnight, at a gate meant to keep danger out, and had instead let destiny in. He stood there, unmovable, unyielding, the weight of the child anchoring him. The kingdom had no idea what had arrived at its gate, but the alpha did, and he knew, with a certainty that burned him from the inside out, that everything, every law, every prophecy, every scar, would have to answer to this moment. Their fate was no longer a closed grave in frozen ground. It was breathing, warm, fragile, held against his chest. The story of the child and the alpha had only taken its first breath.